In 2006, Creepshow 3 was released. With no-name actors, shoddy production values, and no real link to the horror heritage of EC Comics, it feels like a very different film to those that preceded it. So how did this terrible knockoff of a cult classic series get made? Taurus Entertainment, the company behind Creepshow 3, began as a distribution company which snapped up lots of film rights in the late 90s. A few years later, they began to produce content, mostly derived from their existing rights, like a low-budget, raunchier TV adaptation of Compromising Positions and the not terribly promising Chick Street Fighter. In 2005, they produced a universally panned sequel to Day of the Dead, eventually and confusingly followed by a remake of the same. Their efforts on Creepshow 3, if you can call them that, seem to suggest an approach of exploiting the cachet of semi-well-known intellectual properties to sell cheaply made cash-in knockoff titles. With that in mind, let's lower our expectations and take a look at Creepshow 3. It features 5 stories which, instead of being totally separate from each other, actually overlap, Pulp Fiction style. Despite this potentially interesting approach, the DVD splits them up and allows you to watch them separately. There's Alice, The Radio, Call Girl, The Professor's Wife, and Haunted Dog. The quality of the films doesn't vary much, they're uniformly poorly executed and dull. The film begins with an animated segment, and if you thought Creepshow 2's animation was weird, you're in for a treat. This truly ugly animation style is also quite different to the art which features under the opening credits. Obviously, that would have been much too expensive to produce. If you dislike this art style as much as I do, have no fear, it never appears again, not at any point in the whole runtime of the film. The first story, Alice, follows the titular young woman as her life is changed by the discovery of a universal remote that affects real life. So far, so click. But this remote has some odd abilities, like changing her family's ethnicity. Oh, and using it mutates her, for some reason. Really, it's never established. She tries to enlist her neighbour, Professor Dayton, to help, but then apparently decides not to bother and just eats his wedding food. Yes, Professor Dalton's getting married, and yes, this woman just decides to eat his food. There's no logic to the story.
He's getting married? That's fucked up.
It could make sense, I suppose, if the character is supposed to be a younger child. I imagine they decided against that because employing a child actor would be too expensive, and they just decided not to rewrite it. There's some good, gooey gore in the story, but nothing you couldn't see in an episode of The Outer Limits. At the end of the segment, the professor turns Alice into a rabbit, and the story just ends. That's basically it. No real payoff. On to the next story. The Radio features A.J. Bowen, a minor horror actor best known for appearing in The House of the Devil. He's not very good here, so don't get your hopes up. Bowen plays a security guard, Jerry, who lives in a rough neighbourhood. He buys a magic radio from a homeless guy, and the radio tells him to do bad things. If you look closely at Jerry's neighbourhood, you might think it's a little familiar. You'd be correct, as it's a barely dressed use of the Universal backlot city street set. This crops up in countless movies and TV shows, usually with more careful direction and set dressing. Here it's both plainly underpopulated and underdecorated. I hope you don't mind that too much, because most of the film takes place here. The Radio goes about as you'd expect. There's nothing interesting to talk about in the story. It's here that I began to notice just how rough the film felt. The costumes look very cheap. Check out Jerry's security guard outfit, or this very stereotypical pimp here. This is stuff you buy for Halloween. It's just not movie standard. And you can plainly see that some of the shots in the film are first takes. Here, the camera half tries to pan down, and instead of using another take, they just put that one in the movie. It seems like they didn't retake stuff unless it was really, really bad. Otherwise, they'd use their better options. But that begs the question of just how bad it can get, because in this scene, someone actually flubs their line and they just keep it in.
Do you have some? I already sold one of them. Do you have some more for me?
Oh well, on with the story. Call Girl kicks off with a murder as Call Girl Rachel stabs a guy to death. This might be the same apartment building that Jerry lives in, or it might be that they only had one location for that. Hard to say. This one is a serial killer meets serial killer plot with just the tiniest of a twist. The victim turns out to be some kind of supernatural monster. I'm not exactly sure what kind, and it's not set up properly, but, well, that's just the kind of movie Creepshow 3 is. Here, the acting, directing, and lighting is so poor that it feels like watching softcore pornography. It seems that Taurus produced a few nudity-heavy properties, like the evocatively titled Hot Springs Hotel, so maybe the biggest twist here is that no one takes their clothes off at any point.
Maybe.
Next up is the Professor's wife, the closest the movie gets to being good. 2 alumni of Professor Dayton's class, remember him, go around his house to meet his bride-to-be, placing this after the events of Alice. En route, they meet Rachel, remember her, placing this during the events of Call Girl. The gist of this plot is that the guys think the future Mrs. Dayton is a robot, and basically dismember her accidentally. This is a story that might work in a bad issue of an EC comic, so at least it's on the right track. The repeated use of exaggerated flashbacks, complete with their own style, bring to mind Creepshow 1, so that works as well. Unfortunately, it's excruciatingly slowly paced, and most viewers will be bored by the time the punchline rolls around. This is a bit of a running theme. There's plenty of filler in this film, making its scant 100-minute runtime feel much, much longer. Last and unbelievably somehow least is Haunted Dog. An exaggeratedly awful doctor accidentally kills a homeless man with a dirty hot dog and is followed around by his ghost. Most of the runtime here is filler, with 2 whole comedy montages of patients at the free clinic.
Hey, why don't you just bend over the table? Take off your clothes and bend over the table. We'll take a quick look.
But it's just right here.
It's probably a symptom of a deeper problem. Let me grab my probe. We'll take a quick look.
In one very confusing scene, the doctor attends a party run by the monster guy from Call Girl. We're reminded very clearly that it's him because he finds Rachel's card here. Again, this seems to be in the same apartment building that apparently everyone lives in. Inside, after a massive chunk of filler and another run-in with the ghost, he leaves and the monster guy and his mates transform into monsters, presumably to eat everyone. Not sure why really. Not sure about what their game is, why this is in the movie, why it's in the movie at this point, or how they can literally run the same party again the night after, but we're well past logic at this point.
That's right, boy. You and you and you. Woo! That's fine.
So that's the plot of Creepshow 3. The overlapping stories gimmick never really comes into its own. The characters share a universe, but there's no real cause and effect between the stories, no comparison of themes, and it's made very confusing by repeated reuse of sets. And actually, now I think about it, I don't even think the timeline works. In Haunted Dog, Professor Dayton teleports to the street seller, who remarks that he sold some of the special radios that Dayton sold him. That places the story after the radio. Dayton is in a hurry and needs a voodoo kit, presumably for putting his wife back together. That places the story after Call Girl. But in the very next scene, Monster Guy gets Rachel's card, which places this before Call Girl? I think I've thought about it more than the filmmakers themselves ever did, so let's not worry about it too much. Creepshow 3 is a real catastrophe of production. From the cheap backlot sets and costumes, to the rushed cinematography, to the lazy stereotyped characters and stock horror plots, it's almost totally bereft of positive attributes. Its sole saving grace is some good gore design, sadly let down by the use of cheap digital effects. Nowhere is this worse than the final shot of the film, where the creep shows up out of nowhere, says nothing, and then melts into a hot mess of CG garbage. If you're looking for a single symbolic moment to sum up how this film approaches the Creepshow legacy, there you have it. And that was the sad, sorry end of Creepshow, until Shudder announced a brand new show based on the property, premiering in 2019. But that's another story. Thanks for taking time out to watch my video about Creepshow. If you're interested in finding out more about Creepshow 1 and 2, you can see the videos I've linked in the description below. If you liked the video, do click the subscribe button to get my next video essay when it comes out.